52. That number seemed to define Clara's life lately. 52 years of living, of routine, of quiet. Her days blurred together like the grays of an overcast sky. Wake up, make coffee, work at the small-town library, and end the evening with a book that often failed to hold her attention. Her children were grown, scattered across the country, and her marriage had ended quietly a decade ago, a mutual agreement between two people who had simply drifted apart. She told herself she was content, that the stillness of her life was something to be grateful for. But there were moments, in the solitude of her small kitchen or the silence of her empty bed, when a deep ache settled in her chest. It was loneliness, though she rarely admitted it, not even to herself. It was a Tuesday afternoon, ordinary in every way, when Clara found herself at the grocery store. She moved slowly through the aisles, ticking items off her list: bananas, milk, oatmeal. At the coffee shelf, she hesitated, scanning the brands for something new, something that might make her mornings feel a little less routine. Looking for recommendations, the voice startled her, not just because she hadn't expected anyone to speak, but because of its warmth, its casual friendliness. She turned to find a young man standing beside her, holding a bag of coffee beans. He was in his late 20s or early 30s, with tousled brown hair, kind eyes, and a crooked smile that seemed to invite trust. "Oh," Clara said, flustered. "I suppose I am." He held up the bag in his hand. "This one's great. A little bold, but smooth. My go-to when I need a pick-me-up." She smiled, feeling an odd flutter in her chest. "Thank you. I'll give it a try." They chatted for a moment longer, about coffee, the fickle weather, and how the store rearranged its aisles too often. It was light, easy conversation, but it stayed with Clara long after he walked away. As she loaded her groceries into her car, she caught herself smiling. It had been a simple interaction, the kind of encounter that usually faded into the background of her day. But this one didn't. His voice, his kindness, the way he had looked at her as though she wasn't just another face in the crowd. It felt like a spark, small but undeniable, in the stillness of her life. Driving home, Clara found herself wondering, when was the last time someone had made her feel seen? Clara didn't expect to see him again. The grocery store wasn't exactly a place for meaningful connections. But life, it seemed, had other plans. A week later, as she turned the corner into the produce aisle, there he was, standing by the apples with the same easy demeanor and that crooked smile. He noticed her immediately. "Coffee critic," he greeted her, a playful glint in his eyes. "How did it stack up?" She laughed, her cheeks warming at the recognition. "Bold but smooth, just like you said. I think it's my new favorite." That sparked another conversation, one that lasted longer this time. He introduced himself as Lucas, a graphic designer who freelanced from home and shopped at odd hours to avoid the crowds. Clara learned that he loved hiking, made a mean lasagna, and was passionate about photography. He listened with genuine interest when she mentioned her job at the library, even asking about her favorite books and how she decided what to recommend to patrons. It was a rare kind of ease, the way their words flowed. Lucas had an energy about him, a mix of humor and sincerity that made her feel comfortable and alive all at once. When they eventually parted ways, Clara found herself lingering in her car for a moment, replaying their conversation. Over the following weeks, their paths crossed again, sometimes by coincidence, sometimes because Clara started shopping at less convenient times, hoping to run into him. Each meeting was a bright spot in her otherwise quiet life. They began to share more. Lucas would recount stories of his latest projects or the mishaps he encountered while trying to train his overly enthusiastic Labrador. Clara talked about her work at the library, her favorite childhood memories, and even the awkwardness of adjusting to life after her divorce. One evening, while they stood in the parking lot after a chance meeting, Lucas handed her a small packet of coffee beans. "I thought you might like this one," he said with a grin. "It's from a local roaster I've been meaning to recommend." Clara accepted it, touched by the gesture. "You're spoiling me," she said with a smile. "Good coffee is a basic human right," he replied, his tone light but his eyes warm. Driving home, Clara realized just how much she looked forward to seeing him. Lucas brought something into her life that she hadn't realized she'd been missing. A sense of joy, of connection, of being truly present in the moment. For the first time in years, her days didn't feel so predictable. Lucas had brought a quiet kind of novelty into her life, and she wasn't sure what to make of it. All she knew was that she liked it. She liked him. Clara sat on her porch one evening, a steaming cup of Lucas's recommended coffee in her hands. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting golden hues across her garden. She sipped slowly, letting the rich flavor linger, her mind drifting to their most recent conversation. He told her about a weekend hike he'd taken, describing the view from the summit with such vivid detail that she almost felt the crisp mountain air on her skin. His voice had carried an infectious excitement, and she found herself smiling as she listened, the same way she was smiling now, thinking of him. The realization came like a sudden breeze. She thought of him often. More often than she should. Clara set her mug down, her heartbeat quickening. Her chest felt tight, like her body was trying to suppress an emotion too large to ignore. This wasn't just friendship. It wasn't just gratitude for his kindness. It was something deeper, something unfamiliar yet achingly familiar at the same time. You can't be serious, she thought, shaking her head. She was 52. Lucas was young enough to be her son. And yet, when she pictured his easy smile, the warmth in his gaze, or the way his voice softened when he said her name, the age gap seemed to vanish, replaced by something that felt timeless. Her emotions swirled. Excitement, disbelief, fear. How could this be happening? It had been years since she felt anything like this for anyone, let alone someone so much younger. The next morning, she found herself staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Lines creased the corners of her eyes, and silver strands wove through her hair. She touched her face lightly, as if trying to reconcile the woman she saw with the one Lucas seemed to see. "Stop it," she whispered to herself. She wasn't a foolish teenager swept up in a crush. This was ridiculous. He probably didn't think of her that way. But as she went about her day, her thoughts betrayed her. She remembered the way he looked at her when she spoke, how his full attention seemed to belong solely to her, as though she were the most fascinating person in the room. Was it possible he felt something too? That evening, Clara sat with her journal, something she hadn't touched in years. She wrote furiously, pouring out her confusion, her longing, and her self-doubt onto the page. By the time she closed the journal, her chest felt lighter, but the questions lingered. Was it foolish to hope? Or was it foolish to ignore a spark that made her feel more alive than she had in years? Clara couldn't escape her thoughts. Days turned into a blur of quiet deliberation, her emotions a constant tug-of-war between excitement and doubt. The excitement was undeniable. Lucas made her feel seen, heard, and appreciated in a way she hadn't experienced in decades. Every time he smiled at her, every time his voice took on that warm, teasing tone, her heart seemed to lift, reminding her of the woman she used to be, vibrant, curious, and unafraid to dream. But the doubt was relentless, too. What would people think if they knew? The whispered judgments, the inevitable labels, the insinuations of desperation or impropriety. It was enough to make her shrink from the idea entirely. One afternoon, as Clara walked through the library's aisles, her thoughts distracted her from the task at hand. The quiet hum of her workplace had always been her sanctuary, a space where the steady rhythm of shelving and cataloging drowned out the chaos of her mind. But not today. She replayed a moment from their last meeting. Lucas had asked her to recommend a book. She'd suggested a classic novel, Jane Eyre, and his response had caught her off guard. "Isn't that the one about forbidden love?" he'd asked, a knowing smile tugging at his lips. "It's about so much more than that," she'd replied, her cheeks flushing despite herself. Now the memory sent a shiver down her spine. Had he been teasing her? Or was there something unspoken in his tone? Clara sat at her desk, unable to concentrate. Her journal entries had become a nightly ritual, each one an outlet for the tangled mess of her emotions. She wrote about the joy Lucas brought into her life, the weight of her doubts, and the relentless inner voice that told her to guard her heart. But another voice, a quieter, braver one, began to emerge. What if you stopped caring about what people think? What if you allowed yourself to feel this, just for once? Clara wrestled with these thoughts, the possibilities both thrilling and terrifying. What scared her the most wasn't the judgment of others. It was the risk of losing Lucas entirely. If she crossed that invisible line between friendship and something more, Would he pull away? Would she ruin the one connection that had brought her so much unexpected joy? One evening, Clara took a walk in the park near her home, hoping the fresh air would clear her mind. As she watched the sun dip below the horizon, she made a decision. She couldn't ignore her feelings any longer. But if she was going to take a step forward, it would have to be on her terms, cautiously, and with her heart prepared for whatever came next. Clara stood in her kitchen, staring at the phone in her hand, the same way one might look at a precipice before taking a leap. She had spent the last few days debating whether or not to call Lucas, and now, standing in front of her stove, she was filled with an anxious thrill. She had finally decided. She was going to invite him over. It wasn't that she was naive, she knew what it could mean. It wasn't just a friendly gesture anymore. She wasn't asking him to join her for a cup of tea. No, this was more personal, more vulnerable. But she couldn't ignore the longing she had for something beyond what they'd shared so far. There was a quiet, magnetic pull toward him that grew stronger every time they spoke. The laughter in their conversations, the moments when their eyes lingered a little too long. It all pointed to something more, even if neither of them had admitted it yet. She hadn't invited anyone into her home for years. Her life had become an insular world, neatly tucked away from the rest of the world. She enjoyed her solitude, had gotten used to it. But with Lucas, the loneliness she'd lived with for so long felt different. His presence in her life made it seem like the world still held unexpected joy. She wasn't ready to lose that. Her fingers hesitated over the keys of her phone, typing out and erasing the message several times. "Would you like to come over for dinner?" It sounded too formal, too much like a demand. How about something simple, she thought. She started again, typing slowly this time, as though each word mattered more than the last. "Lucas, I'm making a new recipe tonight and I thought of you. If you're free, I'd love for you to join me. No pressure, just dinner." She read the message over and over again, making sure it sounded casual enough, yet still sincere. Her heart raced as she pressed send, immediately regretting the boldness of her decision. Was this too soon? Was she overthinking it? Minutes passed like hours. She paced around her living room, eyes glancing occasionally at her phone. Then, the familiar ping of a new message sounded and Clara froze. "I'd love to. What time?" The warmth in his words made her stomach flip. She hadn't been expecting such an immediate reply, much less such an eager one. Her lips curved into a smile before she even realized it. She had made the right decision. There was something between them, something undeniable. She didn't know what it was, or where it might lead, but for the first time in years, she felt alive with anticipation. As the evening approached, Clara busied herself in the kitchen, her mind spinning with excitement and nerves. She found herself fussing over every detail. The table setting, the lighting, the way the wine glasses were placed just so. She wanted everything to be perfect, but more than that, she wanted to create a space where they could both just be. She thought back to the last time she had entertained someone years ago. It had been a different life, one filled with laughter and companionship. Now, there was a quiet hope that perhaps this moment, this dinner with Lucas, could bring a new chapter into her life, one filled with possibility. As she set the final plate on the table, she took a deep breath, trying to calm the fluttering in her chest. The evening would unfold however it was meant to, and for the first time in a long time, Clara allowed herself to simply be hopeful. The doorbell rang just as Clara was setting the last dish on the table. Her heart skipped, the familiar surge of excitement mixing with a quiet apprehension. She wiped her hands on the dish towel and walked to the door, taking a deep breath to steady herself. When she opened the door, Lucas stood there, looking as effortlessly charming as ever. He wore a casual shirt and jeans, his hair slightly tousled, the kind of look that suggested he hadn't tried too hard but still seemed perfect. His smile was warm and genuine, making Clara's heart flutter in a way that felt both thrilling and unfamiliar. "Hey," he said, his voice low and easy. "I hope I'm not too early." "Not at all," Clara replied, stepping aside to let him in. "Come in. I was just finishing up." The moment he entered, the atmosphere in her home seemed to shift. It was subtle, a change that Clara could only describe as right. Like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something new to unfold. Lucas looked around, his eyes scanning her modest, cozy living room, and then met her gaze. "This place has such a warm feel," he remarked, his tone filled with admiration. "I like it." Clara smiled softly, the compliment settling in her chest in a way that felt unexpectedly tender. It had been a long time since someone had made her feel seen in such a simple, yet profound way. "Thank you," she replied, feeling her nerves begin to ease. They moved into the dining room, where Clara had set the table with delicate care. The flickering candlelight added a touch of intimacy, casting soft shadows across the room. Lucas paused for a moment, taking in the sight of the meal she had prepared. "This looks amazing," he said, his eyes lighting up. "I didn't know you were such a talented cook." Clara felt a flush of pride, but it was tempered by something deeper, something more vulnerable. "It's nothing special," she said, shrugging, but the warmth in her eyes betrayed the truth. She wanted him to appreciate this, not just the food, but the gesture itself. They sat down, and for a few moments, there was a comfortable silence as they ate, both of them savoring the meal but also, it seemed, savoring the moment. Clara couldn't remember the last time she'd enjoyed dinner like this. Quiet, with good conversation, and the gentle hum of connection in the air. It wasn't long before the conversation shifted to more personal topics. Lucas began telling her about his childhood, his family, and his career. His voice was open, unguarded, and Clara found herself drawn to the way he spoke so freely, so honestly. There was no pretense, no mask, just Lucas, in all his youthful, imperfect glory. She responded in kind, talking about her own life, her own history, things she hadn't shared with anyone in years. Her past, her experiences, the dreams she had once had. With every word she spoke, she could feel herself letting go of the walls she'd built up around her heart, the ones that had kept her safe, yes, but had also kept her from living fully. As the night wore on, the wine flowed freely, and the conversation took on a more relaxed, intimate tone. Their laughter filled the space, echoing off the walls like an old, familiar song. Clara hadn't realized how much she had missed this sense of connection, of companionship. But with Lucas, it didn't feel like an obligation or a courtesy. It felt easy, natural. It was during dessert, when Clara was laughing at one of Lucas's jokes, that their gazes locked and held. Something shifted in that moment. The playful teasing, the easy conversation, it all fell away, replaced by something deeper, more unspoken. She felt the intensity of his gaze, and for the first time, she didn't look away. She let herself feel the pull, the magnetism between them that had been there from the beginning. His hand, resting casually on the table, inched closer to hers. Clara's breath caught in her throat as their fingers brushed. The contact was electric, sending a rush of warmth through her entire body. The air around them seemed to thicken, the quiet of the evening suddenly amplified by the rapid beat of her heart. "Clara," Lucas said, his voice low and full of meaning. "I've been wanting to say something for a while now." Her heart skipped, and she could feel the weight of the moment settle between them. She was unsure of what was coming next, but for the first time, she didn't feel afraid. He leaned in just slightly, his eyes searching hers for an answer. I think I've been falling for you," he admitted, his words soft but certain. Clara froze for a moment, the world around her seeming to pause. The confession, though unexpected, felt right. She couldn't explain why, but she knew. In the depths of her heart, she knew. "I don't know what this is, or where it's going," Lucas continued, his voice almost a whisper now. "But I couldn't leave without telling you how I feel." Clara's breath was shallow as she took in his words. There was a rush of emotions, joy, fear, longing, intertwining with the overwhelming realization that somehow in this moment, they had crossed a threshold neither of them had anticipated. And then, without a word, Clara reached out and took his hand, the warmth of his touch grounding her in the reality of what was happening. Their connection, fragile but undeniable, was no longer just a possibility. It was real, and for the first time in a long time, Clara felt alive with the kind of love she had thought she would never experience again. As the evening drew to a close, Clara sat on her couch, the soft hum of the city outside mingling with the quiet stillness in her home. Lucas had left not long ago, his warm presence still lingering in the room like an echo. She had kissed him lightly on the cheek before he left, gentle, tender, yet carrying the weight of everything unsaid. The kiss had been simple, unhurried, but the emotions behind it had been anything but. She was alone now, but the loneliness that had once filled every corner of her home seemed to have evaporated. Instead, there was an unfamiliar sense of peace, a quiet joy that she couldn't quite put into words. She had spent so many years navigating life on her own, convincing herself that solitude was a choice, that she was content with it. And for a time she had been. But now something had shifted, and she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. She had let someone in. And not just anyone, Lucas. He was younger than her, yes, but more than that, he was different from anyone she had ever known. He brought with him a freshness, a new way of seeing the world, one that had stirred something inside her that she thought was long dormant. As Clara reflected on the evening, she couldn't help but marvel at the unexpectedness of it all. She had never anticipated falling for someone like Lucas, someone so much younger, someone who wasn't burdened by the same history, the same baggage that she carried. She had grown accustomed to the idea that love, in her age, was a thing of the past, something left behind with the years that had come and gone. But with him, love felt new, vibrant, and full of possibility. She thought about the age difference between them. For a moment, doubt crept in, a familiar voice whispering questions into her mind. What will people think? What does this mean for your future? Can a relationship like this really work? But then Clara shook her head, dismissing the questions. She had spent too many years worrying about the approval of others, too many years conforming to societal expectations of what her life should look like. Love wasn't meant to be confined by age, she realized. It wasn't something that should be measured by time or dictated by what others deemed appropriate. It was something that could blossom in unexpected places, between two people who saw in each other something worth nurturing. What had happened between her and Lucas was not a mistake. It was not a fleeting impulse. It was real. And it was more than just physical attraction, it was connection. It was trust. It was a shared vulnerability that neither of them had expected, but both had embraced. Clara's thoughts drifted to her own past, her marriage, the years she had spent building a life with someone who, in the end, had left her feeling empty. She had once believed that love had a particular shape and form, that it could only be one thing, one way. But now, in her 50s, she had come to understand that love was not a one-size-fits-all experience. It didn't have to fit any mold. She wasn't young anymore, and she had accepted that. But she wasn't old either. She was somewhere in between, a place where wisdom and experience met hope and desire. And with that, Clara knew she had the power to define her own happiness. Lucas had reminded her of that. He had reminded her that love wasn't bound by age or circumstance. It was something to be felt, experienced, and shared. If it was real, it didn't matter what the world thought. What mattered was how it made her feel, alive, seen, and whole. She smiled to herself, a sense of gratitude filling her chest. She had been afraid to open herself up to love again, afraid of what it would mean to fall for someone like Lucas. But now, she realized how foolish that fear had been. She was grateful for the second chance, for this unexpected, beautiful chapter of her life. Love, she thought, was ageless. It didn't have to fit the patterns of the past. It could be something entirely new. With that thought, Clara let out a contented sigh, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. The night had been a turning point, one she would carry with her as she moved forward, no longer afraid, no longer hiding, but embracing the possibility that love, in all its forms, was something she deserved. Clara woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through her kitchen window, casting soft patterns on the wooden floors. It felt like the beginning of something fresh, something exhilarating. She stood there for a moment, letting the warmth of the day settle around her, grounding herself in the stillness of the moment. It was a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions she'd felt just hours before. The fear, the uncertainty had all dissipated. Now it was replaced with something far more peaceful. Acceptance. Her thoughts turned to Lucas again, his laughter. The way he looked at her with that mixture of curiosity and tenderness, as if he saw her not just for who she was now, but for all that she had been and all that she could be. It was a feeling she hadn't realized she missed, not until he had come into her life. There was a quiet joy in knowing that love was not a destination but a journey, one that could unfold at any time, in the most unexpected of places. It wasn't about age, about where they had been in life, but about where they could go together. The potential of it all was thrilling in a way she had never thought possible. As she sipped her coffee, Clara reflected on the power of love, how it had taught her to embrace her own desires, to defy the limits she had once placed on herself. In the past, she had been so afraid of making mistakes, of stepping outside the lines of what was deemed appropriate. But now, she understood that love was something to be felt deeply, without hesitation, without apology. She no longer cared about what others thought. No more wondering if this was right or wrong, or if she was too old to feel this way. What mattered was how Lucas made her feel, how they made each other feel. That connection, that closeness, they were real. They were enough. Lucas had given her a gift, the courage to love without boundaries, to explore something that, by all accounts, seemed unlikely. And in doing so, he had reminded her that love didn't adhere to any schedule. It didn't have a specific time or place. It was simply a matter of being open, being vulnerable, and accepting whatever came next. Her heart had never felt more full. She wasn't sure what the future would hold. Would they continue to explore this connection? What would others think? But the answers to those questions didn't matter as much anymore. What mattered was that Clara had rediscovered a part of herself she thought had long since gone. The part of her that still had the capacity to feel joy, to feel excitement, to fall in love again. And for the first time in a long time, Clara felt ready to embrace whatever came next with open arms. Love, she realized, wasn't something that only belonged to the young. It belonged to anyone who was willing to open their heart and take the risk. There was no age limit, no expiration date. Love had the power to surprise, to heal, to grow. And it was waiting just beyond the horizon. With a soft smile, Clara set down her coffee cup and turned toward the window. The day ahead was filled with possibility. And for the first time in years, she was excited to see where it would lead.